In West Texas, there is a number that keeps city managers awake at night. It's not a budget line or a population statistic. It's a percentage. 12,003%. That's how much water was left in the Ivie Reservoir on a blistering day in April 2016. A man-made lake spanning 19,000 acres, when full, reduced to little more than a memory. And three cities, Midland, Odessa, and San Angelo, home to hundreds of thousands of people, were drinking from that last 12%. They were months, possibly weeks, away from day zero. Not water restrictions, not conservation notices, the day the pumps run dry and the taps stop working. Forever, what would you do if your city told you it had just months of water left? Tell us your plan in the comments below. This wasn't a theoretical crisis. For the people in charge, it was a mathematical certainty. A horrifying countdown clock they could see ticking in real time as the lake level dropped inch by agonizing inch. So they launched one of the most desperate, expensive, and contradictory scrambles for survival in American history. A race to drill for new water, recycle old water, and pump it all uphill against the laws of physics, even as the ground beneath their feet produced an ocean of water they couldn't touch. We go deep into stories like this that the mainstream ignores. A huge number of you who watch forget to subscribe. If you find this important, take 1 second and hit that button. It's the only way we can keep making these. Let's begin. This is the story of a catastrophe that almost happened, and a bigger one that is quietly unfolding right now. It's a story not just about a disappearing lake, but about a region built on an impossible promise and the astronomical price of keeping that promise from breaking. West Texas was never meant to hold cities of this size. The land is part of the Permian Basin, an arid, unforgiving expanse where the sun beats down and the rain rarely falls. It's a place defined by what it lacks. There are no great natural lakes, no rushing rivers carving through the landscape. The topsoil is thin, the trees are scrubby, and the prevailing wind feels like it's coming straight from a blast furnace. For centuries, this was land you passed through. It wasn't a place you stayed. Then we discovered what was underneath it. Oil, an ocean of it. The Permian Basin oil boom of the 20th century transformed everything. It turned dusty outposts into sprawling cities. Midland and Odessa didn't grow organically over generations. They exploded. They were company towns that became capitals of a global industry. People flocked there for work, for opportunity, for a piece of the black gold that was making America run. They built homes, schools, and highways, creating an urban oasis in the middle of a desert. But they built it all on a foundation that had no water. The men who planned this future knew the risks. They weren't naive. They were engineers and visionaries who looked at the dry landscape and saw a problem that could be solved with concrete, steel, and incredible ambition. Men like Owen Hartwell Ivie, the general manager of the Colorado River Municipal Water District for nearly 3 decades. From 1965 to 1994, his entire career was dedicated to one single, monumental task, finding and securing water for a region that had none. He was a water hunter in a land of thirst. His magnum opus was supposed to be the Ivie Reservoir. The permit was granted on May 14, 1985, after years of bureaucratic and environmental delays, one of which involved protecting a small, non-venomous reptile called the concho water snake, a species found nowhere else on Earth. Protecting a snake's habitat held up $1 billion water project for years, an irony that wouldn't be lost on the people facing a water apocalypse decades later. Construction began in May 1987. The heart of the project was the dam, a colossal structure named after another pioneer of Texas engineering, Simon Wilk Freese. The Simon W. Freese Dam is a rolled earthfill embankment over 3 miles long and 148 feet high. It's a man-made mountain designed to plug the channel of the Texas-Colorado River and its tributary, the Concho River, and force their waters to back up and form a lake. Deliberate impoundment began on March 15, 1990. As the water slowly rose, it swallowed canyons, ranch land, and old homesteads, creating a vast, sprawling reservoir capable of holding 554,340 acre-feet of water. That's over 180 billion gallons. When it was finished, the state of Texas renamed it in honor of the man who willed it into existence, the Ivie Reservoir. It was an engineering triumph, a monument to human ingenuity. But building the lake was the easy part. The real challenge was getting the water to the people who needed it. Midland and Odessa are over 150 miles away from Ivie, and worse, they're uphill, way uphill. To deliver the water, the Kermbud had to build the longest water pipeline in Texas at the time, a 157-mile artery of steel. But a pipe alone wasn't enough. The water wouldn't flow on its own. It had to be forced. They had to lift every single gallon of water 1,400 feet in vertical elevation. Think about that, a 1,400-foot climb. That's taller than the Empire State Building. You can't just use one pump for that. You need a series of incredibly powerful pump stations, each one grabbing the water and violently shoving it higher, fighting against gravity every inch of the way. 6 pump stations in total, spread across miles of desert, consuming enormous amounts of electricity just to keep the taps on in cities 100 miles away. The cost of moving that water, the sheer energy required, is baked into every water bill, a hidden tax on living in a place where water flows up, not down. This system, completed between 1992 and 1995, was the lifeline. It was an industrial marvel designed to defy geography, and for a while, it worked. The lake was full, the pumps were running, and the cities were growing. The impossible had been made possible. But the desert was just waiting. It always waits. The first sign that the system was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit came not from Ivie, but from its sister lakes. The Colorado River Municipal Water District, or CRMWD, operates a triad of reservoirs: JB, Thomas, EV, Spence, and the giant OH. Ivie. They were designed to work together, a 3-legged stool supporting the entire region. But a stool with 2 broken legs can't stand for long. The great drought that began around 2010 hit West Texas with a vengeance. It wasn't a normal dry spell. It was a relentless, multi-year siege. The rain stopped, the temperatures soared, and the evaporation rates went through the roof. The smaller, shallower lakes were the first to go. EV, Spence Reservoir, near the town of Robert Lee, was the canary in the coal mine. Throughout 2011, residents watched in horror as the lake simply vanished. The water receded from the shore, leaving behind vast, stinking mudflats littered with dead fish and stranded boats. By May of 2011, EV. Spence had fallen below 2% of its capacity. It wasn't a lake anymore. It was a geographical scar. Around the same time, Lake J.B. Thomas wasn't much better, hovering at less than 4% full. 2 of the 3 legs of the stool were gone. Shattered, suddenly, the entire water burden of West Texas, for Midland, Odessa, Big Spring, Snyder, San Angelo, fell onto the broad shoulders of one last reservoir. O.H. Ivie. John Grant, the general manager of the KRMW at the time, was faced with an impossible situation. He was staring at the data, watching 2 of his lakes effectively die, and seeing the level of his last remaining source drop at a terrifying rate. He wasn't just managing a water district anymore, he was managing a slow-motion catastrophe. In June 2011, with the crisis escalating daily, he gave a stark interview. Today, Lake Thomas is less than 4% full. The Spence Reservoir is less than 2% full, and Ivie is about 26% full, he said. Then he added the chilling part. I think a lot of people are starting to wake up around here. He was right. People were waking up. But what they were waking up to was a nightmare. With Ivie at 26% and falling, Grant and the KRMW had no choice. They did the only thing they could. They started cutting people off. In July 2011, they imposed a mandatory 20% cut in water allocations to their member cities. It was an unprecedented step, a declaration that the system was breaking. For the residents of Midland and Odessa, it meant strict lawn watering schedules, pleas for conservation, and a growing sense of background dread. But 20% wasn't enough. The drought didn't care about allocations. The sun kept shining, the wind kept blowing, and Ivie kept dropping. From 26%, it slid to 20%, then into the teens. City managers in Midland weren't just looking at charts anymore. They were doing day zero math. They calculated the remaining volume in the lake. They factored in the brutal summer evaporation rates. They looked at the daily consumption numbers, even with the 20% cut. And the answer that came back was unthinkable. They had months of water left, maybe less than a year. The countdown had begun. Spencer Robnett, a Midland city councilman, would later reflect on the sheer terror of that moment. If you think back to 2010, he said, the city of Midland almost ran out of water. Almost. That's the word that hangs in the air. The city was facing its own extinction event. The oil boom that had built the city was now threatening to kill it. By creating a population a desert could no longer support. The panic was real, and it triggered a desperate, frenzied response. Midland couldn't wait for rain. They couldn't hope that Ivie would magically refill. They needed a new source of water, and they needed it yesterday. The only reason they didn't run completely dry was because of a decision made half a century earlier. In the 1960s, a previous city council, with incredible foresight, had purchased water rights at a place called the T-Bar Ranch, a 20,000-acre property out in Winkler County, 60 miles away. It sat on top of a groundwater aquifer. That far-sighted purchase was now the city's only hope. So, in 2012, Midland went into emergency mode. The city issued over $115 million in bonds, not for a new park or a library, but for a survival project. They had to build a 67-mile pipeline from the T-Bar Ranch wellfield to the city. It was a frantic race against time, a construction project driven by pure fear. Crews worked around the clock, laying pipe across the desert, trying to build a lifeline before the old one snapped. At the same time, the Kermdud was scrambling to save Odessa, expanding its own emergency groundwater source, the Ward County wellfield. They were drilling wells, laying pipes, spending hundreds of millions of dollars, all because their massive, state-of-the-art reservoir system had failed. And even as they drilled, Ivie kept falling. The crisis of 2011 and 2012 was a fire drill. The real fire was yet to come. After a brief period of slight recovery, another dry spell hit, and this one took the lake to a place it had never been before. In April of 2016, the Texas Water Development Board released the new number, 12,003% full. The Great Lake, the savior of West Texas, was now more bathtub than reservoir. The boat ramps were stranded high and dry, ending in cracked earth. The old river channels, submerged for decades, were reappearing like ghostly skeletons. The heart of the West Texas water system was barely beating. 12,003%. One more bad summer, one more failed rainy season, and the game would be over. Here is the part of the story that sounds like a cruel joke. While the cities of West Texas were spending hundreds of millions of dollars in a panic to find a few million gallons of drinking water, the main industry in the region was dealing with the opposite problem. They had too much water, an unimaginable amount of it. The Permian Basin oil and gas industry doesn't just pump oil. For every 1 barrel of oil it extracts, it brings up 3 to 4 barrels of water. This isn't fresh water, it's called produced water, and it's been locked underground in saline geological formations for millions of years. It's a toxic brine, saltier than seawater, and often laced with heavy metals and low-level radioactive materials. It is completely, utterly useless for drinking or agriculture. By 2025, the industry was pumping up an astonishing 22 million barrels of this toxic water every single day. Let that number sink in. 22 million barrels a day. That's over 900 million gallons. Daily, an artificial ocean of poison being pulled from the earth. The oil companies don't want it. They have to get rid of it. So they spent billions of dollars on a massive plumbing system designed to do one thing: inject that water right back down into the ground into special disposal wells where they hope it stays locked away forever. This is the great paradox of the Permian Basin. On the surface, you have cities in a perpetual state of drought, rationing sprinklers and watching their reservoirs turn to dust. And just a few thousand feet below them, an industry is drowning in a sea of water so vast it has become their single biggest operational headache. The problem isn't a lack of water in West Texas. It's a lack of the right water in the right place. An apocalyptic disconnect between the world on the surface and the world below. a region dying of thirst while standing on an ocean. When your biggest, most reliable reservoir has shrunk to 12% of its capacity, you start considering things that once seemed unthinkable. You get desperate. And that desperation leads to innovation born of pure necessity. Just up the road from Midland and Odessa, the city of Big Spring was watching the same crisis unfold. They were also dependent on the Krumdude system, also watching OH. Ivie disappear. They decided they couldn't just wait for rain or hope for a pipeline. They had to create their own water. So, they built a $14 million advanced water treatment plant. But this wasn't just any treatment plant. This was the first of its kind in the entire United States. It was designed to do something that, to many people, sounded like science fiction. Or a late-night punchline. It took raw sewage from the city, treated it to an incredibly high standard, and then blended it directly back into the raw water supply that fed the city's main drinking water treatment plant. It was, in the blunt terminology that stuck, a toilet-to-tap system. The very idea is a public relations nightmare. But for Big Spring in 2013, it was survival. They weren't doing it because it was trendy or a neat experiment. They were doing it because the alternative was having no water at all. The plant provided a drought-proof source of millions of gallons a day. It was a closed loop. The city was, in effect, drinking its own recycled water. And it worked. The technology was sound. The water was safe, cleaner than many conventional sources. But the fact that they had to build it at all is the real story. It is the clearest possible sign of a system pushed to its absolute breaking point. The failure of Ivie, this one massive reservoir, forced an American city to pioneer a technology that most of the country still finds psychologically difficult to accept. It's not a success story. It's a scar. A monument to how close they came to the edge. If you think a story this critical needs to be heard by more people, please hit the like button and share this with your friends and family. What's happening in Texas is a preview for other parts of the country, and most people have no idea how fragile the system is. The crisis of 2011 to 2016 was a near-death experience for West Texas. It fundamentally changed the way the region thinks about water. The old strategy, build a big dam, fill a big lake, and pray for rain, was officially dead. It had failed. Relying on surface water in one of the hottest, driest parts of the country was no longer a viable long-term plan. It was a gamble that had almost ended in ruin. So, the cities pivoted. They had to. San Angelo, which had its own reservoirs but was also watching them decline, was already developing a different source. The Hickory Aquifer, a deep underground formation that required expensive wells and treatment plants but promised a more reliable supply. Midland had its T-Bar Ranch pipeline. Odessa had the Ward County well field. The future of water in West Texas was no longer in big, beautiful lakes. It was deep underground, in aquifers that had been there for millennia, accessible only through hugely expensive drilling and pumping operations. This new reality was formalized in May of 2020. The cities of Midland, San Angelo, and Abilene joined forces to create something called the West Texas Water Partnership. It was a historic alliance. For decades, Texas water politics had been a game of every city for itself. Now, they were banding together out of shared fear. The partnership signed a massive 50-year agreement with a private entity called Fort Stockton Holdings. The deal was simple. The partnership would pay to build a massive pipeline system to pump millions of gallons of groundwater from aquifers near Fort Stockton, over 100 miles away, to supply their cities. It was the T-Bar Ranch strategy scaled up to a regional level. A multi-billion-dollar bet on groundwater. A final, definitive turning away from the unpredictable lakes that had betrayed them. I know we mentioned it before, but if you're still watching and haven't subscribed, we're basically drilling for viewers at this point. It takes 1 second, helps us immensely, and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive. It's genuinely the only way channels like this survive. The message was clear. Never again. Never again would they be held hostage by rainfall. Never again would they watch a single reservoir like Ivie drop to 12% and threaten their very existence. They were buying their way out of the drought cycle, building an infrastructure of survival that was independent of the weather. It was an expensive, audacious plan. But after staring into the abyss of day zero, no price seemed too high. They were building a future where the level of Ivie was still important, but no longer a matter of life and death. The lake itself, it recovered. For now. A few wetter years brought inflows back to the Colorado and Concho rivers. As of July 2026, Ivie is sitting at around 47% capacity. It's healthier. The immediate crisis has passed, but no one in West Texas is celebrating. They know how quickly it can disappear. 47% is a long way from 12%, but it's also a very long way from 100%. The lake remains profoundly vulnerable. One hot, dry summer and the downward slide begins again. For the fishermen who now flock to Ivie, it has become one of the premier trophy bass fishing lakes in the world, regularly producing 13-pound giants. The water level is a constant topic of conversation. They see the stained shorelines, the bathtub rings showing where the water used to be, and they know the lake's health is fragile. The bigger problem is that Ivie isn't an isolated case. It's a symptom of a much larger disease spreading across the entire state of Texas. While West Texas has spent billions to secure its future, other parts of the state are now living through their own 2011 crisis. As we speak, the state is collapsing into a water catastrophe zone by zone. Travel southeast, towards San Antonio. There you'll find Medina Lake. In July of 2026, it sits at 3.9% capacity. That's not a typo. 3.9%. For years, the lake has been functionally gone, a ghost of its former self, its barren, cracked bed, a symbol of the region's profound water deficit. Go further south to the town of Three Rivers. In mid-2026, the town issued an emergency disaster declaration, not because a hurricane was coming, but because their water supply, the Choke Canyon Reservoir, had dropped so low they were literally days away from running completely out of water. Days, the same terrifying countdown that haunted Midland a decade ago, is now the lived reality for other Texas communities. The crisis hasn't been solved, it's just moved. The state is caught in a perfect storm. Relentless population growth, driven by people moving to Texas from all over the country, is colliding with cyclical, and now intensifying, droughts. The infrastructure built in the 20th century was never designed to handle this level of demand, combined with this level of scarcity. The Texas Water Development Board, the state agency that tracks all of this, delivered a breathtaking forecast in 2026. To secure the state's water grids, to keep the taps from running dry in the coming decades, Texas communities will need to spend an estimated $170 billion. $170 billion. That's the price tag for new reservoirs, new pipelines, new desalination plants, and new recycling facilities. It's the cost of rebuilding an entire state's relationship with water from the ground up. The story of Ivie wasn't just a local drama, it was a warning flare, a preview of a future that is now arriving for communities all across the American Southwest. The 12% number wasn't just a statistic, it was a prophecy. It showed what happens when we build thriving modern economies on a water supply that is fundamentally unreliable. West Texas acted. They drilled, they piped, they recycled. They spent the money and built the systems to ensure their survival. They looked at the 12% number and vowed never again. But what about the other towns? What about the places that don't have the oil wealth of Midland or the political clout to build 100-mile pipelines? What happens to them when their lake hits 12%? What happens when their town is the next Three Rivers? The desperate measures taken in West Texas, the emergency pipelines, the toilet-to-tap facility, the multi-billion-dollar groundwater deals, they weren't a solution to the drought. They were a reaction to it. An incredibly expensive Band-Aid on a wound that refuses to heal. The rain still isn't falling enough. The climate is still getting hotter. The population is still growing. And under the ground, the great aquifers they are now turning to are themselves finite. You can only pump them for so long before they too begin to run dry. Ivie sits there today, half full, a placid-looking jewel in the West Texas sun. But it's no longer just a lake. It's a monument to a close call, a reminder that survival in the desert is never guaranteed. It has to be fought for, engineered, and paid for, day after day. The pumps that lift its water 1,400 feet into the air are still running, fighting their